So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's BIC Brunch session. My name is Karina Urquhart, and I'm the Executive Director at BIC and your host for this session. This BIC Brunch series of thema sessions is brought to you in collaboration with EDItEUR, the organisation that manages and develops the Thema standard. Today's session will be exploring the use of Thema for children's, teenage and educational material, otherwise known as the Y Thema subject category code. So, I'll just go to the next slide. Bear with me. There we go. So, why the new series? At the end of February this year, we announced that the BIC standard subject categories scheme, or BIC codes, as I guess you'll all know them, will be made obsolete by February 2024. This series of thema sessions will run until at least February 24 to help support the industry through that transition. So we've currently got the following sessions lined up for you. So in September, we have popular non-fiction. In November, we have a session on academic non-fiction, and then in January, we have a session on comics and manga. There will be more sessions coming up to take us through to February 24, and as we get speakers confirmed and scheduling confirmed, we'll promote those and advertise those to all of you if you're following us on our mailing list. The sessions run about every couple of months. And you can book onto any of our upcoming BIC brunches or training sessions by following the link on the screen there. And just as a reminder, we've had some BIC brunch theme sessions already. In March, we had our first one, which was on adult fiction. Then we had a guided tour of everything that was new in Thema version 1.5. And then in May, we had a session on diversity, equity and inclusion. So all the recordings for those sessions can be found via the links on the screen. Don't worry if you're trying to scribble down those links. I know they're quite long and not very easy. We'll be sharing the slides, and of course the session will be recorded onto YouTube as well, so you'll have another opportunity to get access to those links. Do feel free to tweet about the event today using the hashtag @BICBrunch. So, just some housekeeping before we get started. So we will have some questions at the end of the session. So once all the speakers have given their presentations, there'll be an opportunity for you to make the most of them being here. So please do ask questions. Don't be shy. You won't be identified by asking a question unless you want me to identify you. We will just ask the question. The event's being recorded for BIC to use in its marketing and to let people that weren't able to attend today to view the session later on. As I've said, attendees, you won't be identified in the recording today. And finally, just a gentle reminder that BIC is a neutral membership organisation, and as such, we politely ask that all attendees and all speakers avoid any comments, conversations or questions that might be considered commercially sensitive or anti-competitive. So thank you for that. So here's the running order for today's session. I won't spend too long on this slide, but just to say that first off, we'll be starting with Chris from EDItEUR, followed by Jack at Penguin Random House UK, and Ivan at the O'Brien Press. We'll have a Q&A session that should take us up to around 1 o'clock-ish, and then about half an hour for questions or so, and then we'll wrap up. We'll aim to finish the session at 1:30. So BIC, who are we? Many of you on this session today will already know who we are, so please bear with me. For the benefit of those who aren't familiar with BIC, we're a UK-based not-for-profit members organisation at the heart of the book industry, creating standards, best practices and resources forming part of the DNA of your supply chains, helping your organisations become more efficient, save money, become less wasteful and ultimately greener. We hold a unique position of trust facilitating UK and international industry-wide collaboration to reach agreement on dependable standards and best practice in the supply chain. We do this in a variety of ways, including running 5 strategic committees focusing on metadata, libraries, physical, digital and green supply chains. We offer training and events and workshops, and we execute supply chain related projects for and on behalf of our membership and also the wider industry. We operate 3 industry recognised accreditation schemes, and you can find out more about everything we do on our website via the link on the screen there. So that's enough about BIC. Back to the purpose of today's session. As I've already mentioned, today's speakers will share expert hints and tips on how Thema can be used by publishers and booksellers and the industry as a whole to help with the discoverability and promotion of children's, teenage and educational material, otherwise known as the Y subject category. We'll start with a general introduction to Thema, which Chris will provide, before moving on to explore the topic in more depth. There's a lot to cover, so I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to hand straight over to Chris Sainer, Standards Editor at EDItEUR, who will give that brief introduction. And then we'll be talking, amongst other things, talking us through the new Y codes that have been added in Thema 1.5, explaining the importance of interest age and reading age, and discussing how important it is to remember that format is not the subject. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Chris. I'm just going to change presenter, so those watching, please bear with me. There we go. Everything okay, Chris? There we go.
Hello.
Hello.
I think I buffered for a brief minute there. So,
I couldn't tell if you were standing very still.
It's the summer, so I got the beach ball. So
I'll leave you to it now. Thank you.
Apologies. Thank you, Karina, and welcome everybody. So in today's session, I shall be talking to you a bit about the Y area of Thema. Y covers children's, teenage and educational, and by educational we mean stuff that's aimed at pre-primary, primary and secondary level. So just briefly, so the first few slides are slides I've used to introduce each of the presentations, so I won't dwell on them. I'll just pick out 1 or 2 things on each of the slides. You can see them, they're available on each of the recordings, and also you can get copies of the slides from BIC. Karina will be sharing them. So EDItEUR, as most of you are aware, we're a small not-for-profit international organization, and we manage the standards, and one of the standards we manage is Thema. And Thema, what is it? So again, this slide I've used several times, so I'm just going to pick out a couple. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, I'm just going to pick out a couple of things. And I think when we're talking about material aimed at younger people and the use of Thema, what's really important to remember is this is an international system. It's an international standard. It's also multilingual, multicultural. It has to work for a domestic, small local audience as well as a global audience. So we have to remember that when we look at how we define the codes that you may use for the material aimed at children or teenagers. Other aspects of Thema that are very important, I'd say, when we're looking at this particular side, choosing the right codes, choosing which is the right code to make the principal code, the main subject, is very important. It's really important to be as accurate as possible when you're classifying books aimed at children or at teens. Really important. It's a whole age range where people are changing, constantly learning new skills, learning to read, developing new interests. So accuracy is incredibly important with the children's material. And also another point on this slide is we say Thema is a subject categorization. It's not a target audience code, but perhaps the Y section is where there's the biggest overlap, because we've got a notion of children and teens in the heading. So there is a slight notion of audience implicit in the Y code. Just a reminder of the structure of Thema. So there's about 3,000 subject categories, of which there are 404 Y subject codes. And we have the qualifiers. Qualifiers are very important for all the subject codes, particularly important for the Y, as we shall see in this presentation. And also remember, when you're exchanging metadata, when you're sending or you're receiving it, what you get is the code. So that code is what's exchanging the metadata, and then the headings and the notes are available in English, but also are translated into many other languages. And then we have our 6 general rules of Thema classification. These are guidelines, they're not enforced. As I've said before, there's no Thema police, but you can find a copy of these on the EDItEUR website. They're also on the browser, so you can see them there. And again, all of these are important when you're classifying. They're all important for using the Y section. But again, pick out a few. Main subject, the notion of main subject, critical when you're categorizing material aimed at younger readers. Two, accuracy, very important. Use the appropriate codes for that. 4, qualifiers. As we shall see with Y, it's the one area where there's almost an obligation to use at least one qualifier. And context. Context is really important when you're categorizing this material to get the right codes. So we're going to be looking at the Y section. As most of you will know, there was an updated version of Thema that was released in April, and there was a presentation done about all the new codes, which you can watch on the BIC YouTube channel. But just to remind you that one of the areas that the working group spent a lot of time looking at was the Y area. It was the one that got the most attention. So there was a lot of updates done to notes and to wording to make it clearer what could be used. But in the end, 55 new codes were added into the Y area, where it was felt there were gaps. And this is just to highlight a few of them. So for example, because of the expansion and the number of books in the fantasy area for children and teens, we added some fantasy things. If you're using the browser and you want to know when was a code added, you just can use the show button. It will show you when a code was added or when it was modified. Another area where we added, there was already existing code for emotions, but we added in some codes for specific emotions because there are a lot of books, especially aimed at younger readers, about emotions. And another area was in the sports and outdoor interests. The working group saw a couple of areas where there would be gaps, so we added in some codes there. So if you're using Thema, we're familiar. This is the main areas of the Y section. So we're going to have a look at them briefly. You've got things like YB. YB is quite a broad heading, covers quite a few areas. The heading can be a bit deceptive because it has the word early learning in it. YB isn't only for early learning, it just happens to be one of the subheadings of that is the early years, early learning concepts. Because, so we have that. Early years is possibly one of 2 areas where we have a notion, more specific notion of age included in the heading. The other one is baby books, YBCB, but we also have picture books and picture story books. Picture story books can appeal to all various ages, so not just for the very young. And of course, their picture story books are it's a fiction code. And then we have the YBGs. This is when the interactivity is the subject of the book. It's a coloring book, or it's a book where you do stick things in or you search for something. But there's no notion of format in these codes either. The non-fiction section, so quite a comprehensive non-fiction section, covers broad areas. Some of these have subheadings. You can see that when there are 3 dots, there are subheadings under these. And we also have the YX section, which again, non-fiction topics. But when you look at this list, a lot of these topics, when the material is aimed at younger readers, is often covered in fiction. So it's very common to use YX codes with YBCS, which is the picture story books, or with the YF codes, the fiction codes, because a lot of these topics are covered via fiction. And something I want to emphasize, when you're doing subject codes also need to have a complement audience information. In Onyx, you can do this by taking a value from list 28, the audience codes. It's very simple, children or teenage. For education, there's a bit more detail in there. And also you can add in audience range. It's really, really critical information for titles aimed at young people. You need an interest age, you need a reaching age, and even more important, if there's a difference, which happens, higher interest age, lower reading age, it's really important to include that. Both are absolutely key to finding age-appropriate material. If you're publishing educational material, then you also should be adding in school grades. Some of these you can do in Onyx. For example, the US system you can express in Onyx. UK, Ireland, you cannot express that in Onyx. There is no list, but you can do it really well in Thema. Thema has a very comprehensive list for the United Kingdom, for the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, for Ireland, and for many other places. So interest age, I'm sure you're all aware, the interest age, this was the age the book was written to appeal to. So the subject matter in the interest age of 13 to 16 was written to appeal to an average 13 to 16-year-old. Reading age, so this is the level of reading ability that the text requires in comparison to the ability of an average child of a particular age. So reading age of 9 means that a book can be read by an average 9-year-old. And remember, these are guidelines, very important guidelines. If any of you have ever tried to buy a book for a child, or if you're a parent, you know how important these guidelines are so that you can make informed choices. But of course, every child is different. So when it comes down to each individual title, child and adults will make the decision. And just to show you what that looks like, how that appears in the Onyx, here we've got a book with its thema codes, but also a little bit of Onyx that shows the audience. So we put in a 02 code to say this is a book for children. And then we've put in the interest age. And we've done a very clear from 4 years to 6 years. That's what you use Onyx for. Other major area of the Y section is children's fiction. Covers most of the major genres, but you may say, why is there no middle grade fiction? Why is there no juvenile fiction? And the one I get most often is, why is there no young adult fiction section? Well, it comes down to what I mentioned earlier. This is an international multilingual system, and all 3 of these lack precision. Middle grade, even though it's been started to be used in other countries, comes from the United States, specifically refers to their educational system. Juvenile as a word can mean youth, adolescent. Many languages, it gets translated to the English equivalent of teenage. And as for young adult, if we're talking about human development, then it usually refers to the years following adolescence, so adults in their 20s. In some book markets, young adult has now come to mean books aimed at all teens, so from 12, 13 to about 17, 18. Some markets, it's come to mean books aimed at over 15s, over 16s. So it lacks precision. It lacks the precision of language necessary in a standard. So what we have in Thema, we replace words with numbers. We have these qualifiers that use the ages. They're universally understood. They make sense to everybody. So one of the obligations, if you use a Y code, you must have one 5A qualifier going with it. Exception for that is the YP educational, which you can use a 4 code. We'll come to that in a bit. If you're creating Onyx and you've got an system, then you can program your system. If you're adding the lower interest age for Onyx, that can add it automatically as a Thema qualifier, or vice versa. So let's take, as an example, let's say we've got a series of books that are using, amongst other Thema codes, the Thema code for unicorns. And we can then, so 5ABH, this is aimed for small children above the age of 12 months. 5AG, above 6. 5AK, 9 and above. 5AP, 13 and above. 5AS, 15 and above. That information is very clear. It'll be in the metadata. People who receive it can make use of it as they wish. To give you a clearer example, so this one I've used 5AQ from 14 years. It qualifies these 2 fiction codes. somebody who receives this in their metadata could either display it directly, or they could map that into what they call teenage fiction. Or if they're in certain parts of the world, they might map that into something called young adult fiction. We also have other qualifiers like these two relating to gay people and to transgender people. So somebody receiving it might have a section called YA LGBTQ+ fiction, which they can then map this to. Or they may look at the main subject and say, right, I'm going to map this into my YA LGBTQ romance section. Or they might just put it in the romance section and then display the other codes and qualifiers. This book, so we've given it in, here we have the 5AF, the interest age from 5 years. So again, we could make decisions about, are we going to put it in picture storybooks, or are we going to put it in the children's fiction, family and home stories? Up to the publisher to decide and classifying which is the most important. But the important thing here is to remember that that 5AF qualifies all the subject codes. It also effectively qualifies the other qualifiers. The thing to remember about Thema is a qualifier isn't just with one subject code. A qualifier is with all subject codes. So if you're using a qualifier, it applies to every single subject code that you include in that. And just using this one to remind us about one of the 6 rules is number. 5 is a good maximum number of subject codes to set. That's a good limit. Unusual to find that you need more than 4 subject codes, and often 1 or 2 is enough. So remember that. And then another book, again, aiming this one at the younger readers, and this 5AC applies to all these subject codes. But when we look at the subject codes, they all talk about what the book is about, but none of them mention the fact this is a lift the flat book, because the format is not the subject. Format is described in Onyx. So Thema doesn't have any formats in its subject codes. There's a really good list, this 175. There's a lot of choice for children's books, so you can accurately describe what format it is. So in this case, B202, lift the flat books, which will go into your Onyx like that. Now, as you're all probably aware, Thema allows for the mixing of fiction and non-fiction codes. But what about mixing Y codes with A to W codes, which we might call the adult codes? So you can do that, but the important thing is to remember, you must include a 5A code. 5A, really important. And then you should always look at the Y codes first. Find the appropriate Y codes. There are quite a lot, there are 404 of them. Most things can be covered. And one of those Y codes must be main subject, okay? And then, for example, this book, you can add an adult code because there is no subject code Gaelic football inside the Y section. So we're giving that extra level of detail that's really important. But remember, the 5AH in this case also applies to the SFBK. So you can use Y A to W codes with Y when you want to give that extra level of detail. It's no point doubling. So there's no point in also putting in the SFB code, which would be, or the SF code, which would be the ball games for the adults, because that would just be a double. Same applies to graphic novels. You can mix X with the Y codes, or you can mix X with the A to W codes. There'll be a talk about this in January. You can never mix all 3 X, Y, and A to W. But the 5AQ applies to all the codes. Then again, it's up to the publisher what they decide is the main subject. Is it the graphic novel? Is it the YFN subject code? And the last bit of the Y section is YP, educational material. Educational material in the Y section, we're talking pre-primary, primary, and secondary education, not tertiary education. YP, there's a really good comprehensive note at YP that gives some further explanation about how to use the YP, what you can use it with. We quite often do this in Thema. We try and put sort of how-to notes high up in the hierarchy. That will apply to everything in the YP. Inside the YP, there are 5 broad categories that cover broad areas of education. And then if you dive in, you'll see that there are different subjects. Again, remember, Thema is international and multilingual. Often, if you work in the educational sector, you'll know that sometimes subjects get grouped together and get called something else. Thema can't have all those different things. Thema has all the subjects. You just have to find the subjects, even if it's called something. Sometimes you may need to use more than one code. And with the YP codes, you need to use 4 qualifier as well. These are the educational purpose qualifiers. So these are mandatory with the YPs, like 5A is mandatory with all the other Y codes. You can, of course, use a 5A code with the YP codes as well. YP applies to material that's aimed at class use, but also home education. You can mix YP codes with other Y codes, but if its primary purpose is educational material, then choose the YP as the main subject. As you can see from this example, we've got 3 different 4 qualifiers to give different information. We're giving a very specific information about England and Wales national curriculum, but we're also using one of the broader codes to say it's for primary education and for home learning. We're also putting in a 5A code. Onyx, of course, can contain more detailed information. So we could use one of the audience codes, primary education, to confirm it's for primary, but also we can put in the age range, in this case, 5 to 7. A book aimed at a classroom. Again, this one, we have 1 YP code. That's all we need. It's a chemistry book for education. Don't need any other codes. But we've used 4 different educational qualifiers. Again, we're saying it's for secondary education, it's a textbook, it's for classrooms, and then we're saying it's part of this aimed at specifically at Key Stage 4 in England and Wales, and it's part of the AQA system. Again, we've put in an interest age just as an extra, but once you've got those 4s in, you don't necessarily need the 5 code. And in the Onyx, we say this is the student edition, 3rd edition, and we put in the fact that it's aimed at lower secondary education, and we give the audience range. Age ranges have the advantage of being universal, so they can be understood by everybody, so they're useful for putting in the information. And finally, we have the teacher's version of the same book. Now, this is one of the rare occasions when we say use adult as the main subject with a Y. Most of the time we say it's too confusing to use Y codes with A to W codes. But when you've got teachers material, the content is aimed at adults, at the teachers. So use the JNUM code as main subject along with the Y and also the 4. Notice I've taken away the 5A code as well, because my primary subject is teachers. It's the adult one, so it's aimed at an adult audience. And we also notice change some things in the Onyx, just said it's an edition for teachers. And that's it. Here's some links where you can find more information, and I'll hand it back to Karina. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Let me just do the mechanics. So before we go over to Jack, just wanted to make a few observations, if I may. I think the main thing that's coming, well, one of the main things that's coming through is the importance of accuracy. So that's arguably that's true for every area, every sort of subject classification. Why do you think that's particularly important? I'm probably asking a very obvious question, but why is it? Why do you think it's particularly important for children's, for the Y section? Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Continue.
Because any of you who work with children, have children, educator, whatever, or you've tried to buy books for children, it's an age we're changing all the time when we're young. You know, it's a period for those first, let's say, 20 years of your life. Things change really quickly. You're learning to read, you're learning about things, and material published reflects that change. And so, for example, certainly for younger children, you get very, very narrow age ranges when it's suitable for a particular age or a particular interest. And even for teenagers, you change a lot through those teenage years as you move into adulthood. And it's really important to give that information. Again, individuals will make choices. There are adults that read children's books. There are children that pick up adult novels. That's different. But that information in metadata is really important for those who are searching for books, librarians, booksellers, educators, parents, as well as the children themselves, to know, is this suitable? Is this the right thing for me, for my class, etc. As an ex-bookseller, it's really frustrating when you're advising a parent, is this suitable for my 12-year-old who, I don't know your 12-year-old. You need guidance so that you're not misleading. You're not going to give that parent something that's actually suitable for much older teenagers, contains material that may not be age appropriate. You need to know that.
It's trust, isn't it? It's building that trust with your reader and with your booksellers as well. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you ever so much, Chris, for that. I'm sure there'll be more questions from the audience later on. So I'm now going to ask Ken, I'm just going to check if you can see my slides, okay? Can you see my slides, okay? Anyone? Chris? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Jack. I'm going to ask you, Jack, to take the virtual stage as we say goodbye to Chris. And Jack is Senior Bibliographic Coordinator at Penguin Random House UK and is going to talk to us today. And was going to share some background with us with regards to how classification is managed at Penguin Random House generally. And then with the help of worked examples, how it is managed more specifically in the children's division. So I'm going to hand the screen over to you, Jack. You should have it coming your way now.
Okay. And can you now see my presentation? And nothing but?
The nothing but, and your good self, of course.
Okay.
So I'm going to disappear now. So over to you, Jack.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. So I am, I'll just move myself there. I'm Jack Lowe, and I'm a Senior Bibliographic Coordinator at Penguin Random House UK. Today, I'll be talking about thema classification for children's titles at PRH, talking a bit about our approach to classification and taking you through some worked examples to explore some of the key features of thema and some of the challenges I come across when classifying. I'm part of the wider bibliographic metadata and ONIX team at PRH. We look after all aspects of bibliographic metadata for our titles, guiding it on its journey from initial setup of records, pre-acquisition through to feeding out in ONIX, publication, and then continued enrichment over its publishing life as part of the catalogue. Our centralized approach to the creation and maintenance of book metadata helps to ensure continuity and accuracy, which is obviously essential for such a large publishing catalogue like that of PRH. Working directly but not only on classification, we have 5 bibliographic coordinators and a bibliographic assistant, guided by a bibliographic metadata development manager. Each coordinator looks after 1 or 2 divisions, working closely with editorial and sales to ensure that books are classified correctly. I'm responsible for Penguin Press, publishers of Alan Lane and Penguin Classics, and Penguin Random House Children's. That's why I'm here today. Classification at PRH is a long process with several stages of review from pre-acquisition through to divisional meetings where we glean information about subjects or themes, and it also includes regular reports that flag updates to copy, so we can make changes on the basis of that. Finally, all books are reviewed by the bibliographic development manager close to publication, and any omissions or inconsistencies are flagged for the coordinators to correct. Now, a bit more about Penguin Random House Children's. So the division is home to the 3 main customer-facing imprints, Ladybird, Puffin, and Penguin, and we continue to publish a catalogue that includes Random House Children's imprints such as Red Fox. Penguin Random House Children's is the home of many well-known series and brands, including Beatrix Potter, Spot, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Bluey, and many more. Most genres of children's publishing are covered, excluding textbooks for a formal educational setting, and we publish a variety of formats from typical paperback YA fiction to board books with wheels and lights to audiobooks. There's plenty of scope to put most of the children's Thema code list into practice, therefore. So a bit more on the approach we take to classifying children's titles. First and foremost, we're aiming for accuracy. What I mean by this is that books are classified according to their subject and according to the advice of editor, i.e. the first category is the primary subject. Add as many categories as required, but don't use thema codes like keywords, and observe the scope notes. Accuracy is key in helping customers and consumers make informed choices, as we've discussed, about the suitability of titles, and Thema's excellent range of subjects and qualifiers is a really big help in this respect. As well as classifying with accuracy, it's our aim to provide rich metadata and to ensure that children's titles are classified with as much applicable, useful information as possible, making full use of the code lists. In practical terms, for Thema, this means paying close attention to usage notes to ensure that all useful qualifier codes are also included. For example, work for learning modern languages should include, alongside the subject categories, the interest qualifier, the language qualifier, educational purpose qualifier, as Chris has shown already. And I'll be discussing this again later. In providing rich metadata, we give our recipients more options to display our titles and make them accessible and discoverable. In both of these cases, the Thema online browse tool shown here, which I'm sure you've all seen before, but I can't reiterate enough that it's extremely helpful. It allows you to see codes at the top level and then quickly drill down to as much detail as you need without losing the context of the wider classification tree, and scope notes are immediately accessible, which is very important. And for me, children's classification also demands specific attention to consistency. The combination of varied formats and subjects and age suitability combines with recurring characters, series, and authors, and there should be an attempt to establish uniformity across all these variables wherever they do repeat. I don't want to stray too far from Thema today, but this extends to the numerous other industry standard classification schemes and age range information that we send in Onyx, and we provide this in line with BIC Product Data Excellence Award accreditation. So these include age range, CBMC code, BISAC, and for the time being at least, BIC. These all need to marry up, and each time a new Peppa Pig picture book, try saying that repeatedly, is published, it should be classified according to both its own content, but also in line with the rest of the series. This ensures that recipients can trust the implied relationship between one title and another and can then sell the work accordingly. It also makes titles within these groupings more discoverable because they can be listed as series and such. So lastly, and by no means least, timeliness is of the utmost importance. We need to ensure that as much of our metadata, including Thema classification, is complete as early as possible. And this is useful both for external metadata recipients as well as for internal reference and processors. The scope of our Onyx feeds begins at 9 months from publication, so we aim to have all mandatory metadata complete by then. This includes classifying with as much accuracy and detail as possible at this time, at the very least having a main subject in place. Our classification processes help ensure that adjustments are made to classification as more detail is added to the book's record. For example, when copy is added or updated by editorial teams, we get that in a report, for example. We aim to get full classification by 16 weeks to publication, which matches the BIC Product Data Excellence Award completeness and timeliness criteria. Now, what better way to illustrate this theory of Thema classification than putting it into action with some worked examples? So I've selected a few examples from PRH's extensive catalogue to highlight some of the key aspects of Thema classification. So first off, it's a children's classic, or is it? Matilda will be well known to many of you, but there might be some debate as to whether it qualifies as classic fiction. Although published in 1988, we felt that classic fiction was most appropriate as the first and therefore primary Thema subject on the basis that the alternatives, fantasy, family, and home or school stories carry too strong a genre on their own, or as the primary codes. They still make up important strands to the story, so rightly take their place in the lineup of subjects, and we've also included codes from the YX children's personal and social topics to highlight these significant themes. Moving to a more strongly genre-focused work, this title is a good example of thema strength when classifying books with a specific historical and geographical setting using thema's place and time period qualifier codes. Ruta Sepetty's The Fountains of Silence is a romantic historical YA novel set in Madrid in the 1950s under Franco's rule. Thema allows us to describe the setting, Madrid, and also the time period, the 1950s. Additionally, the Spanish National Extension Code allows us to specify the period of Franco's dictatorship specifically for any metadata recipient that's able to process or display that information. We chose both of these time qualifiers because even though they overlap in terms of meaning, they have slightly different uses within the code list. And you can see here from the screenshot that neither leads from or to the other in the code hierarchy. They can sit side by side. For this title, following the codes for historical fiction and relationship and family stories, we've also included the general interest politics to reflect the narrative's focus on the political situation in the years after the Spanish Civil War. Next up is a non-fiction sticker book, Rebel Girls of Black History. This is a sticker by number activity book highlighting the lives and contributions of several important Black women in US history. Information about the format of the book, a sticker activity book, is provided in other parts of the Onyx feed, as Chris has talked about already. So this title has been classified primarily according to its subject, biography and history. The stickers are accompanied with a biography for each person. So there is a kind of a significant part of it. It's made up with biographical information and historical information. We've also added girls and women, general interest subject, as recommended by the Thema scope notes that you can see here. And we've also added diversity and inclusion to reflect that this book recognises the achievements of historically underrepresented women. In Thema, we're able to add interest qualifiers to say if a specific group of people are the subject of a book. So for this title, we can say that it relates to African American people. Furthermore, in Thema 1.5, you've got here in the list of codes in italics. In Thema 1.5, we'd be able to say add the additional 5p BD relating to people of the African diasporas or heritage. So when we've got 1.5, that will be even more detail. The combination of these subjects and qualifiers means that we can be very specific in saying who the work is about, but in doing so, we only enrich the classification and improve discoverability and therefore representation too. I should point out that interest qualifiers are also used to express the base age range, which Chris has talked about a lot already. So that complements the age range metadata that's included in other parts of the feed. And for this title, it's 5AG, so from 6 years of age. Having already spoken a bit about the importance of rich and consistent thema classification, I'd like to illustrate both of these points with a title from our Ladybird Readers series of graded readers for learning English as a foreign language. The text is The Tiger, the Brahmin and the Jackal, and it's a popular Indian folklore tale. The Ladybird Readers series currently numbers 177 titles, so maintaining consistency across this series just in and of itself can be quite a task when new tranches of titles are published every year or two, sometimes with different editors, sometimes different bibliographic coordinators responsible at the time. So the key here is establishing mandatory requirements based on the Thema scope notes and applying these across the series. So in this case, the primary subject of modern, non-native or second language learning readers, that's an educational code, and it also requires an appropriate fictional general interest subject reflecting the actual subject of the text. So the folklore tale, so here it's traditional and animal stories, and we've also included an India place qualifier for the setting, because that might be of interest to readers as well. We also have to add the language qualifier to reflect the language being learned, which is English, an educational purpose qualifier. In this case, we've used the Cambridge English exams for LEA code because it the whole series of Ladybird Readers conforms to that qualification scheme, and then the 40Y home learning because that's the main intended setting. An interest age qualifier also has to be added, of course, and there are the varying levels to this series. This one's level 3, this title's level 3. They're tied to ability rather than age primarily, but there are rough age brackets, and that's reflected by the interest qualifier. These subjects and these subjects and qualifiers combine to give an extremely full picture of the subject and suitability of the book, and something that's really only possible in Thema, providing metadata recipients with the opportunity to process, display, and use the books in a variety of different ways. However, this information is only as useful as it is consistent, and it has to be a true representation of the content of the work in question, and then also where that sits within the wider Ladybird Readers series. Now, I'd like to finish with a couple of examples of the new Thema 1.5 subject classification codes in action, and how useful we'll find them to be. I say will, because we haven't yet been able to implement Thema 1.5 in our bibliographic systems, but we do look forward to it. So Jack and the Giant Tantrum, I do know the editor of this work, actually, who's also was one of the authors, and I hope it's not about me, but anyway. A picture book about emotions. This is featuring monsters as the characters. It's part of a Monster Town series of books addressing the sometimes challenging behavior of small children. In Thema 1.4, we can give this the primary code of emotions, moods and feelings, but Thema 1.5 brings with it the excellent addition of individual subject codes for specific emotions. You can see there in the screenshot. So this reflects the variety of publications on the theme of emotions, and that they often tend to focus on particular feelings or behaviors rather than being on kind of the whole gamut of human emotion. Our next favourite addition in Thema 1.5 is that it's now possible to add adult codes for a children's title if it serves to add extra detail that's not available in the Y code list already. It makes sense that a primary Y subject is still required to make clear it's a children's book, and the usual qualifier requirements for children's titles still apply in terms of age range and the rest. So Utterly Unbelievable World War II was published in partnership with the Imperial War Museum, and it features interesting facts and stories about the conflict. While it's possible to achieve a fairly thorough classification using only the Y subject codes, the main subject, the Second World War, would otherwise be absent if we weren't able to add the adult code. To make it clear that it's a children's title, this has been added last in the order of the subjects, and we welcome this change to the Thema scheme, and the fact that it opens up endless more opportunities for the classification of children's titles without increasing the size of the code list. So, final word on the challenges of Thema classification and where it will take us to next. As I mentioned, the implementation of Thema 1.5 still lies ahead. This will mean making the codes available for selection in our publishing systems, as well as the painstaking process of mapping and manual enrichment of Penguin Random House's extensive catalogue, numbering in the tens of thousands. It's also dependent on the speed with which the rest of the metadata supply chain is able to receive and process the new and updated codes of Thema 1.5. While our processes for classifying front list are robust, the sheer size of Penguin Random House catalogue poses a great challenge, as great a challenge for enrichment, in fact, as it does an incredible opportunity for boosting discoverability and sales. Updates to classification schemes, while truly welcome and useful, definitely, only add to this challenge. So backlist enrichment is an ongoing and ever-evolving process, responding to industry changes as well as to internal business needs. For me personally, I'll be continuing my campaign of classification consistency across Penguin Random House Children's many series, brands, and imprints, in particular on the education titles. To help with this, I've actually been working on a series of series-specific categorization guides based on EDItEUR guidelines and their usage notes to support both coordinators and editorial in making the right decisions on setup and classification. I'm sure we'll all agree that accurate subject classification takes time, and it can sometimes be hard to devote as much time to it as we'd like. The scope for refinement and revision really is endless. I particularly found that, trying to choose examples for today and getting the subject classification just right with my colleagues, and then also working with Chris, it can take as long as you are willing to give it, and you can always come up with maybe slightly different interpretations. Nevertheless, for me, it's an excellent opportunity to learn more about the titles that I help to publish in other ways, and to put that knowledge to good use. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jack. Fantastic. It's good to get an insight into the world of Penguin Random House in terms of classification and bibliographic data. It's obvious from what you're saying that it's a hugely collaborative workflow right across the different roles within your various divisions. And as I'm sure Ivan will say later, great to have a dedicated team looking at that area. So we're going to hear a very different perspective, I think, from Ivan in a minute. Great variety of worked examples, so thank you for that. And what's coming through as well as from you is the importance of consistency and timeliness
Yes.
across the piece, and bearing not looking at your sort of titles in isolation, but thinking, you know, are they part of a series? What else has the author written? Where does this character appear in other places in the list, etc., and making sure that that's all sort of joined up writing, as it were.
Yeah.
And just the sheer size of your catalogue. So the importance. Yeah, go on.
I meant to emphasize that from the point of view of it being a challenge rather than it being a trumpet toot. But it does present, because at any time, if say for example, even quite a small change is made, introduced with a new scheme, or even if editorial decide that the suitability, you know, maybe needs a small change, it often requires changing hundreds of titles at once. And we have ways to do that, but you know, there are limitations in what you can do without manually going through titles. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much. Again, as with Chris, I'm sure there'll be questions from our audience. In fact, I know there is one already. So we'll hold off on the questions until Ivan has done his piece as well. So thank you. If you wouldn't mind, yes, please. If you could hand the screen back to me, that would be great. Thank you very much.
There we go. Did that work?
There, I don't know. Did it work? Yes, I think it did. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I should have done this earlier. Bear with me. Just whizzing through yours. There we go. Excellent. This is where we need to be. So thank you, Jack. Now going to hand over to Ivan, our last but by no means least speaker, Ivan O'Brien from the O'Brien Press. So we've just heard from Penguin Random House, undeniably a very large publisher. And Ivan is going to talk to us today about Thema from a different perspective, so that of the smaller indie publisher. And through worked examples, we're going to hear from him about O'Brien Press's processes, bit of a tongue twister there, and general principles for classifying new titles and backlists. We'll hear a bit about regional and geographically specific content, and the reality of subject classification for smaller publishers. So I'm going to change the screen over to you. Oh no, I'm not. I'm going to do your slides myself. That's right. So over to you. If I just get your first slide up, that would be helpful. And I will disappear. So over to you, Ivan.
There we go. I'm in. Thanks very much, Karina. That's great. I'm feeling a bit intimidated now because Chris and Jack know so much more about this subject than I do, because it's not the core of my job, and I suspect that's probably true of an awful lot of the people listening in here. We don't have dedicated teams, and we didn't actually build the thing ourselves, so we're trying to fit it around the rest of what we do. You can move on to the next slide there, Karina. Just a little bit about who we are, in case you don't know. So O'Brien Press is a family-owned independent publishing company, founded in 1974, so we're nearly 50. About half of what we do is children's books, and about half of what we do is general books. So that 25-ish new titles a year, that's children's books. We do about 50 in total. And our children's list runs the gamut from board books to picture books to series fiction, YA novels, activity books, whatever you're having yourself. It's a broad range of children's books. The next slide shows our bibliographical data journey, because as has been made clear already, there are several components and elements of this jigsaw that all fit together to describe our books in full. Oh, you skipped one there, I think, Karina, did you? Our bibliographical data journey, thanks. I don't know if anyone else here has been around long enough to have filled in manual Whittaker forms, which we used to do, and then you'd put them in the post and you'd never change your data beyond that. And so what appeared on anybody's systems on their microfiches would often be wrong. We migrated to using Onyx all the way back in 2008, using a software package called Anko, and then we switched over to Stizen, which we currently use, back in 2013. And at that point, we were working with Onyx 2.1, and we migrated very straightforwardly to Onyx 3 in 2015. We've had our BIC product data excellence gold star for quite a few years now, and proudly hold it, because I am a data nerd and I want our data to be as good as it can possibly be, because particularly as we're small in a small place, this is a way of making sure that people all around the world can get to hear about our books in a way that they probably wouldn't otherwise. We migrated to Thema 1.5 a couple of months ago. Stizen look after that for us because we don't have our own in-house custom system, so we can enter all those codes that Jack is jealously looking at as it stands, and have been doing. Personally, I led the group that designed the Irish national Thema extensions back in 2016, which EDItEUR implemented. And so those are available to anyone in the world, but obviously would primarily be used by Irish publishers. How did we go about generating Thema for our backlist? Move on to the next slide, please, Karina. The first thing was, we had the BIC data, which we got originally from Nielsen, and it was in rag order, but it was a good starting point. So we tidied that up. We bulk mapped from BIC to Thema, because Thema basically derived from BIC, so that was straightforward, but obviously BIC is an awful lot more fine-grained. We reviewed and enhanced that data in a spreadsheet, just to allow for sorting and filtering and creating codes across series and groups and everything, and then imported the result into the database. So it is a big task. At that point, we'd maybe 400 children's books, 400 other books. That's a lot of stuff to look through in detail, and it felt like a real slog, but it was absolutely worth it. Because at that point you end up with some reliable data, and it means that you can find your own stuff quite apart from people outside the building being able to find stuff once you get the hang of using your database as well as it should be used. Next slide, please, there. So how do we go about dealing with a new title? We don't have a dedicated bibliographical team. So I build the first element into my process, because I'm the person who takes a signed contract and puts the information from that into our title database. So at that point, it's the first time when we really know what the book is and when we're constructing data about it. So when I enter in the data, I look at what the book is, what we know about it, and put in the Thema codes, trying to be relatively rich, but obviously the book will develop and evolve later, and we don't send our Onyx out at that point yet, so it's slightly less critical. We're also slightly later than PRH when it comes to sending our Onyx out. We would start about 6 months ahead of publication to make sure we stay the right side of BIC and of the booksellers. So at that point, we review the Onyx codes. At that point, my colleague Aoife, who's the person who actually ticks the Onyx button, will also look at them and see if there's anything missing. And then the last time it's reviewed formally is when the finished books arrive in from the printers as part of my process, where I make sure that it's, we've recorded all the key data, the book thickness and weight and all that jazz. I check the codes as well. And at that point, often there'll be some minor revisions, hopefully. Following that, it's all really ad hoc, to be honest. So if a promotional opportunity arises, typically for ebooks, what fantasy stuff have you got? We'll look for the fantasy things, and at that point you might see, well, actually we've underspecified some of the fantasy books there, and add the additional codes. And the other time when it happens is either when a new version of Thema comes out, and there's a bunch of new codes that look interesting, or indeed at sessions like today, I found myself over the last hour while listening to Chris and Jack amending the data on some of my books because I'd missed stuff or things could have been enhanced. So we don't have the structures and the facility to review large amounts of data in a structured, ongoing way. So it is a bit ad hoc. But when you revise one title, particularly in a series or a subject area, it's a great opportunity to revise it for a whole bunch of other ones. So for example, I added a new code to all of our children's historical fiction following a conversation with Chris the other week when we were talking about relates to children from the past, which actually wasn't a code that I'd put in them. So I just exported all of my historical fiction titles, added the code in a spreadsheet, re-imported that into the database. So they've now all been updated. That's kind of the way it works. Moving on to my first worked example. I'm going kind of from young to old here. So my first book of GAA is a board book featuring Gaelic sports. So our primary code, in each case I've highlighted the primary code in bold, is YBCB because it's a baby book. Then I'm using the children's code for sports and outdoor recreation. And then I'm using two non-children's codes, the SF codes for Gaelic football and hurling. And then we have an age qualifier, 5AB. Okay, moving on. Billy Conquers Nature Spotting Adventure. So this is a picture book with hidden objects about habitats worldwide and endangered species. And myself and Aoife had a debate about which was the best primary code. I had the hidden object search and discover one, but then as an ex-bookseller, she said, well, within a bookshop, that's probably not a great region to be in. Actually, if you put it under nature, it'll get better placement in the shop. But by all means, we have to say that it's got hidden object search and discover elements in it. And she was absolutely right. So I changed that primary code. So you do have to have your bookseller's hat on where possible when thinking about this, because the primary code will determine the main place where a book will be put. Then obviously we have the social topics. Thankfully, environment, sustainability, and green issues does exist within the Y tree, so it makes sense to use that rather than a general code. And then this one is for slightly older, 5AF, interest age. Next up, we have Where Are You Puffling, which is a lovely little picture book, storybook set on Skellig Island, which you may recognize from the last few Star Wars, where Luke Skywalker hangs out there when he's hiding for the big bad universe. So this is a picture storybook. It's set in Kerry, in a very specific place, but actually in terms of the geographical qualifier, I've chosen to use the Atlantic coast of Ireland qualifier. You see there 1DD or IE, so that's an Irish code, and then ZA, because the booksellers who will sell this book are spread all along the west coast, and we didn't want to put people off in Galway or Donegal by explicitly labeling Kerry. So that's why we've gone with the Atlantic coast of Ireland there. And then there is a Y code that relates to birds, because obviously birds are our primary characters here. And then we've got 5AC as the interest range, because it's a young picture book from age 3. In this case, we also have a coloring book as well as a board book. And in the case of the coloring book, all the other codes are the same, but the primary is YBGC because it's coloring book rather than a picture book. Next worked example. This is quite similar to one of Jack's ones in many ways. Bright Sparks, Amazing Discoveries, Inventions and Designs by Women. And it was in discussion with Chris that I realized that actually there was a Y code explicitly about inventors. And then we've gone YNB because it's talking about the people. And I had a bit of a debate about, is this book primarily YNTD or YNB? But we decided that because it's more about the inventions than the people who did the inventing, that we'd put YNTD first. Then there's the biographical bit. And then obviously, because of the selection of people we're talking about here, we had to have the YNMF there for the girls and women and the age qualifier. Because this book is about women from throughout the world and throughout history, we haven't put any geographical or time period codes because they would have restricted rather than showing the full range of the book. Moving on to young readers. So this is a first reading book. So actually there isn't a thema code for these because it's not a chapter book, which is the first specific code that goes beyond picture books. It's funny, this one kind of wedges right in between a couple of existing thema codes. So we put this in just as a humorous story because that's what it is, and then general, modern, and contemporary fiction with an interest qualifier showing the age. And that's it. We've got enough. Don't need any more information than that. The next one, however, is quite specific because this is a children's historical fiction set explicitly during the Great Famine in Ireland. So what's first code? It's historical fiction. Next up, we've got an IE time qualifier for the Great Irish Famine put there because there are a lot of books for children and adults covering that period. It's a family and home story relating to the lives of children in the past, and specifically includes plagues, diseases, and famines, which is not a Y code, but strangely, there isn't a famine Y code in Y, so we had to find that in the general area. It's set in Ireland, and it's for 9-year-olds or thereabouts. The next example is also an historical fiction. So again, we've got the YFT as the primary code. This is set during the Irish Revolutionary period. So I could have just put in the specific year, but because it relates to that period in Ireland, it kind of made more sense to put it in there rather than just saying this happens in 1920. We say it's the Revolutionary period, which encompasses 1920. We have the lives of children in the past. And again, I've used an N code here because this is specifically about an uprising or a rebellion. In this case, geographically, it's very focused. It takes place in one particular county in Westmeath. So I've put that in, bearing in mind that in terms of the hierarchy, if you're looking for books about Ireland, you will see books from Westmeath and indeed any other part because it's got the one EDItEUR section in there, which is Ireland. And then 5AK, again, the interest age 9 up. So this is a very specific one, both in terms of region and in terms of time period. Moving on to the last example. This is very different. This is YA. And so we start off with just YFH. This is children's fantasy. It does feature LGBTQ characters, so very important to have that there. And it includes romance. Now, there is a fantasy romance subject, which I could have put it under, but in our view, the romance is an adjunct to the fantasy. So we put YFH as the primary code and got the romance in via YFM or to ensure that we didn't have a parent-child code in there, which could cause confusion. In addition to saying that we cover the topic of LGBTQ+, it was appropriate also to put in the relating to code for 5PS for LGBT, as well as the interest age 5AS. So there are my worked examples. The general principles we apply on the next slide. As you can see, a lot of attention paid to the main subject and thinking about where we would really like to see it in a bookshop, because that's what drives the main code. Additional codes can be non-children's where specific, but if we explore the tree well enough, it turns out there are a lot more specific codes than I'd realized. And don't forget the finer geographical or interest qualifiers when you can, because they will help in a number of ways. And that is me done. Very happy to answer any questions on any of this, of course.
Great, thanks, Ivan. Yes, the Whitaker forms, crikey. Posting things, who does that anymore? Does anyone post anything? I don't know. Yes, if you got theme of 1.5 in ahead of Penguin Random House, so not that anyone's competitive, of course.
I think we managed to get our silver star from you guys before them too, or definitely before an awful lot of people did. So nice to see everyone coming up to our level.
Brilliant. And I love the fact that you said it was really interesting when you said that the new thema releases for new codes spark new ideas, and that actually as a result of this session you've even made some changes or edits to some of your books already. So that's brilliant. It's a nice way to think about the new thema releases actually is sort of a idea generators as well. And the point you made about having a bookseller perspective, you know, how important that is about, you know, where is your book actually going to appear, and what do the booksellers want. I think that's something we mustn't forget as well. That's really important. So thank you for that. Any questions we'll take? Well, I think it's round about now, isn't it? I think we have, we're going to go over to our Q&A. So I'm going to invite, yeah, that's it. And Jack, if you could put your camera on as well, that would be great. I'm just going to move the slides on a little bit, just so there we go. So Q&A. I'm just going to check and see if we've had any questions come in. I know we had one in for you, Jack. So yeah, so what does don't use subject categories as keywords mean?
I mean, it's kind of just a slightly more colloquial version of limit it to, you know, 5 or so. But in short, if there are lots and lots of peripheral subjects that a book covers, then you don't need to put all of those as subject codes in Thema or in any other classification scheme. We have keywords that we can use to cover all of those, and they do, you know, they are mapped by Onyx recipients. They help get into the right browse nodes on Amazon, and they help for people to find those titles when they're doing searches. So it's kind of saying that there is a distinction between between keywords and Thema. We try to be a little bit kind of purer when it comes to allocating classification codes, as much as you can say that, and really stick to what the book is about, rather than any thoughts that might occur from maybe from a marketing point of view. That's the rough idea. I wondered, maybe it was a bit provocative to phrase it like that, but yeah, that's the general idea. Great,
thank you. While we wait for some more questions to come in, I would encourage everyone. There's no such thing as a silly question either, so ask away. We won't reveal names, as I've said, so if you've got anything you want to ask, please do take this opportunity now. In the meantime, while people are thinking, I've got a couple of questions. So let's start with a sort of a more broad question, I guess. How many subject codes are too many? Because the temptation might be, because there's so much, there's so many possibilities, and many books aren't just about one topic, are they? They're about many different things. And is there a limit on how many is too many? Chris, do you want to go first?
Yep. So as I pointed out, we set a guideline of 5, 6 subject codes. Probably when you're hitting that level, you're getting to the right level. If you've got more, then you should start thinking about, this comes into the keywords question. Is that really what my book is primarily about, or is there something I should highlight in the description or in the keywords? Because by adding too many, you dilute too much. Both Jack and Ivan had really good examples of using the full possibilities of Thema with subject codes and qualifiers, but without using an excessive amount. Because you are, as Ivan pointed out, thinking about booksellers, and booksellers don't want 30 codes. They want, you know, I need some basic information. You know, remember the chemistry example? I just use one code because it's a school book about chemistry. So you just need one code, and that's fine. There are other ways you can express other information using things like Onyx. Don't know if Jack or Ivan want to add something to that.
I mean, I agree completely. I would agree.
Yeah.
We agree.
Right.
I think I sometimes try to think about it. So if one of the other subjects that I had applied were changed to be the primary code, would that at least make some sense? Is kind of how I try to narrow down. You know, not that you ever would want it to be the case, but does it? Would that be justifiable if a customer or a bookseller was looking for books about that subject and it came up with yours? Would they think this is wrong, or would they think, yeah, I can see why that might be useful?
I kind of use the opposite, well, kind of the same, I suppose, but coming from the opposite direction. You know, if someone was searching for a book about X, would they hope to find my book? And if so, then I put it in as a category. But the other thing, I suppose, is just to say that subject codes and qualifiers are separate there. You're talking about 5 subject codes, but if you end up with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 qualifiers, that's kind of in addition rather than coming out of the 5.
Absolutely. Especially when you look at books aimed at teenagers or young adults, quite often you can easily get to 5 using YFs and some YXs because they often cover major themes. And then I think in the Cemetery Boys example, I think I have about 5 or 6 qualifiers with that, and they all make sense. That's the thing, is that the point about if somebody was looking for a book about this subject, would you recommend this book? I did a training session with some publishers in Canada, and one of them said, well, we have this book, and I wonder about using the qualifier for Paris. And I said, why? Why would you use the qualifier about Paris? What's the justification? Oh, they change planes in Paris. And I said, well, if you were looking for a book about Paris, does this bring you, would this? And I said, no, okay. I mean, it was just a part of a to and fro question thing, but that's a good example. You know, Paris features, there's a chapter when they're changing planes, but it wouldn't make sense to give it to somebody who's looking for a book about Paris.
Yeah, it's not the core subject, is it?
Absolutely.
But even just spinning off on what you were saying there and referring back to a couple of things I said earlier, the conversation about what subjects a book should have leads to a better decision. You know, before, those worked examples that I showed weren't all the same as that before I sent them to Chris, you know, because he suggested quite a few changes and enhancements, and then I ran through them with Aoife and she suggested some changes as well. So, you know, the more you think about it and the more you investigate the tree, and that's where actually the tree on the EDItEUR site, because all the notes are there and everything, can be really good, because if you put in a search word, it won't just find it in the subject name, it'll find it in the notes. And very often that'll guide you to finding something that's more appropriate than the thing that you are more familiar with already.
Great, thank you. There we have a question come in from our audience. Oh, hang on, it's just disappeared. Let me find it again. It says, am I right in thinking that being allowed to combine Y codes with adult codes is a new feature of Thema 1.5?
I'll clarify. No, it's not a new feature. Thema from the starters has this notion that you can use different codes together. What we did with the major revision when we were looking at the Y codes, we thought, well, let's make it more explicit. Let's make it clear where it really makes sense. So, for example, both in the sports section and the history section, we don't want to recreate the whole sports section in Y, but as Ivan showed, you may have a book for children on GAA. You've not got a GAA section in the Y, so it makes sense using the adult codes. History, the history section has a lot of extra information. It's useful to use them with that. So we haven't changed anything. Every update to Thema always is backward compatible, so we can't change the basic rule. We just tried to make it clearer, give more advice in the notes, especially where we think it might make sense to use an adult code. Because we have to remember, for a lot of retailers, they're very cautious about that concept of you're sending me an adult, something adult, because we all know you do not want the wrong material to get in front of the wrong age group.
Yeah.
So they want to be careful. It comes back to the number of codes, the number of keywords. If you're finding the right Y codes, use those. It's only, I think Ivan's examples were very good. Very specific topics, can't really express them, but they are what the book is about. It's about the Second World War. It's about GAA. Then you bring in those adult codes. But explore the richness of the Ys and of the qualifiers before going into the adults.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, we're getting quite a few questions. This is great. Next one, could or would you ever use a 4 educational qualifier code and a 5 age qualifier code together? Go on, Chris.
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, go on.
What we say in our guidelines is with every Y code, use a 5A, except with YP when you should use a 4. As I showed in my examples, Jack had it in his examples, you can add the 5A along with 4s because it gives indications as well. But sometimes the 4 is enough for primary education, and as we know, some educational material has a broader thing. The 5A may not make sense, but you've got to have a 4 with a YP and a 5 with the rest. It does no harm to add the 5A. I thought Jack's example of the ladybird, the reader, that's a good one, because there are age bandings there, but it's also more about language levels. So that was a good example of using the 5A, but you might have readers where it doesn't make sense to have the 5A because it's more about what level A1, A2, B1, B2. The Common European Framework of Reference for language levels make more sense, for example.
Yeah.
But
okay.
if it's for young people, it does no harm to have the 5A along with the 4s.
Okay. Hopefully that answers the question. I don't know, Ivan or Jack, did you want to add anything?
I was just worried I'd done something wrong for a second, so I'm glad to. I'm glad to hear that that's encouraged.
Okay, great. And then there's one more question that's come in. We are preparing to launch an illustrated non-fiction series for children from 4 years, running to 20 titles. Should the primary code be the same for all of the books in the series to ensure consistency? So
I would say not necessarily. The primary code should be what the book is primarily about. Yeah.
I guess that question is coming
be linked
from,
if there are a series in Onyx, there's a place for naming a series and putting series numbers and all that. So Thema doesn't need to do that.
I guess the question comes from Jack's comments around consistency. I don't know, Jack, if you want to.
No, there probably should have been a caveat to say that, that is, that the primary code is the same every time is entirely dependent on the subject being the same every time. So in the case of readers, even though the text is changing, that one was the Indian folktale, but we've got all sorts of different classics that are used as the texts. That's never the primary code for readers because the primary code is always a reader, and that's always the most important code for those books. And then the subject codes that sit underneath them, folk tales or historical fiction or whatever, will change depending on that. And from my point of view, the consistency is actually mostly in the qualifiers and making sure that all of the qualifiers match up, and that the age information is the same for a book that is the same as another book. But I would have thought for a historical series, you would want the primary one to reflect, to reflect whatever the main subject is. Although I suppose the YNH would actually maybe be the primary one. I don't know what you think, Chris.
If it's a series of illustrated non-fiction, what people are primarily going to be looking for is the subject. As Ivan said, Jack has pointed out, the consistency is important. Consistency in how you express the name of the series in Onyx and linking. If you've got a shared character, there are ways of saying these all books are about a character. But if I'm looking for a gift on rocks and minerals, I'm looking for a book on rocks and minerals. And then it just happens it's also part of that series. That series information is important, but it's elsewhere. So the consistency comes from across different subjects. So it should be in the similar kind of subject code for BIC as for Thema. It should make sense with the children's book marketing categories, things like that. But if not every book in a series is about the same thing, you need to choose the right subject code.
Okay, thank you. While we're waiting, we have a few more minutes. I've got one while our audience is perhaps thinking about some more. Do you think it's sometimes not always easy to remember what to use Onyx for versus what to use Thema for? And do you have any tips that might make that easier? So we've just touched, haven't we, in the answer to that last question about what Onyx can be used for versus Thema, but also looking at children. So we've got books that we're using the subject code to say that they're activity interactive books, but yet we're saying it's nothing to do, that Thema is not for the format. I just wonder if that might be an area of confusion for people potentially, and if so, are there any sort of quick tips that you can give to our audience to sort of think, well, that's what you use Onyx for and this is what you use Thema for?
When you're talking about Onyx, we're using Onyx as shorthand for all the information about your titles. You may do it in other things. Both Jack and Ivan were giving good illustrations of the holistic approach to where they review each title. And that's what you're looking at, the maximum amount of information. Thema is there for, this is what the book is about, this is the shelf you put it on. There's other places where you do, it's part of this series. It features this character, it's written by this person, and it's published in this format. So however you communicate that information, if it's in Onyx or you send a spreadsheet or you fill in something on an interface, you know, you're going to say it's lift the flap. A retailer then has that information, will take it from the relevant place and say, if somebody wants to see all my lift the flap books there, it's fine. But if somebody wants to see all my Christian titles, there's a subject category for that. So yeah, just remember Thema, BIC, big subject codes. It's about what the book is about, and it's just one aspect of the data.
But I suppose in the Y tree there are a couple of exceptions to that, things like baby book and activity book, which do stray a little bit away from subject. But in that case, I just say, you know, put it in both.
If in doubt, put it in both. Okay, and then age ranging, whose responsibility is that? Is that marketing? Is that publishing, editorial? Where do we think that responsibility sits? Or does it vary?
In my experience, at least, it starts with editorial, and then in meetings that often gets refined. So that sort of information is included when other teams get to see information about the books on title information sheets, for example. And so other parts of the department might have a view on that and say, actually, no, we feel that this, you know, sales, for example, might have a view that they can sell it to a different group in terms of interest, because it's interest age that I'm thinking about mostly when looking at age information, and then often basing the qualifier on that interest age. So it's kind of a group. It's kind of a group effort initially led by the editorial teams. And then I mentioned that for some of the education series, I've been working on like guides to help classify across the entire series. And in those cases, I often end up kind of reiterating to editors what they've told me in the past, that this series is suitable for a particular age group. And then, you know, there is sometimes a bit of inconsistency about what you get from other teams about ages, and then you kind of remind them that this was originally what was said, and they say, actually, yeah, I remember that now, or they say, no, maybe we need to make a change here, and that's when it comes to, you know, making changes on a large scale, like I was talking about before.
Yeah, we have age ranging for all of our children's books as kind of one of the first discussions. Particularly for novels and reading books, more complicated when it comes to picture books, and also more complicated for us when we do books in the Irish language, because the average child, to get back to what Chris was saying about the average child side of it, the average child is not as fluent in Irish as they are in English. So when we publish even the same story in both languages, we would usually have the age qualifier higher for the Irish language version, because the average child will be a couple of years older by the time they can read it.
Okay, great. I think, oh, no, go on.
I was just going to say, I'll go back to those examples, and I'll go back to the readers example that Jack used. Those readers, as does Ivan's Irish examples, there's a level of reading ability that goes with them, or language ability, that are really important, but you still need that guidance, because if you're a level, for example, if you're level A2, you might not, but you're 16, you're not necessarily going to want to read one of the Ladybird fairy tale books, even though it's the same language level. The interest level is completely different. So
So it's all that information. Sometimes when you're publishing children and teenage books, it seems like there's an awful lot of extra information, but it's really important. It helps everybody to find the right book.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have to stop the Q&A session there because we are, oh, are we out? Yes, we are out of time. So thank you to our audience for putting those questions forward, and thank you to the panel for giving brilliant responses to those. Hopefully that was informative and answered the very questions that were asked from our audience. So I'm going to have to wrap up now, so let me just go back to my screen. So thank you to everyone. I'm just going to wrap up. So today we've heard from our fantastic speakers how Thema is an international multilingual system or standard for use locally and globally. We've heard about the importance of the principal code and how it is important to get, how important accuracy is, particularly with children's material, and how that accuracy is all about building up the trust with the consumers of your content. So whether that's a bookseller, a librarian, the end customer, etc. We've heard that there's a slight notion of audience implicit in the why area of Thema, and we've heard how important it is to use at least one qualifier with the why section. Oh, sorry, when the why section is the primary code. We had a quick whiz through the 55 new codes in the why area in Thema 1.5, and we sort of emphasised, or at least I hope we've emphasised the point that format is not the subject code, and that format should be described in ONIX. We've heard about the differences between interest age and reading age, and also we've had a discussion around what it was an optimum number of subject codes, and I think we've agreed that sort of 4 to 5 is the maximum, but the fewer the better, and it really because your recipient, your content recipient, wants to know what the main topic of that book or that content is. So really don't dilute the message by having too many codes. We've heard about the importance of qualifiers to enable greater granularity and discovery, and we've heard about the importance of timeliness, accuracy, richness and consistency when classifying your content or your books. We've heard from a larger publisher, we've heard from a smaller publisher, very different perspectives. And also what I really like is the fact that the new Thema code releases can be used as a mechanism to help spark new ideas. And finally, just the importance of getting it right first time. So without further ado then, that brings us to the end of today's session. We'll make the presentation slides available, as I've already said, for the event. So that will be in the next couple of weeks, if not before. And the recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly as well. But we will contact you all to let you know where the slides are and when the recording is available. So you don't need to do anything. If you're keen to stay up to date with what we're doing at BIC, with all our work, our projects and events, do sign up to our mailing list. It's on the screen there. And in the meantime, I would like to refer you to 2 BIC Bites on Thema. They're BIC Bites number 14 and 15. 14 is a general intro to Thema, and number 15 is an introduction to Thema for booksellers, which might be interesting for any booksellers and but also publishers on the call as well. They're free to download and available to everyone. I'd like to take the opportunity to say a massive thank you to our speakers today on behalf of BIC and everyone attending. Thank you to Chris, Jack and Ivan for taking the time out not only to be with us today, to share your experience and expertise, but also for taking time out to put your presentations together, to liaise with each other, to practice, rehearse, etc. That all takes time. Shouldn't underestimate that. And then finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for coming along today. Thank you for joining us. Stay in touch. You can find out more about us on our website, and we hope to see you at another BIC event in the future. Take care until then. That's the end of the session. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.